Well, good morning.
Good morning, Sigrid. How are you doing?
I'm doing as well as can be under all the circumstances. How about you?
Yeah, it's been surreal, crazy, difficult times. But I think we're getting hopefully to a place you can see light at the end of the tunnel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. You know, I was just reflecting this morning before I get into the interview that it's been maybe 12, 13 years since we first met, and you came down to Santa Barbara to help review a concept called Fossil Free by 33. And we were in a yurt up the Gaviota Coast at
I
El
remember
Capitan.
it.
And
It's like glamping.
Glamping, yeah. It was like a lifetime ago. And here we are, 12, 13 years later into the fossil fuel story, and so much has happened, a lot to unpack there, and quite interesting and timely that we're having this discussion the day after the price of oil dropped to zero or less than zero, which is just kind of a moment we would not have, I wouldn't have seen coming.
I know. I mean, yeah, the state has a goal. Many other states, I think there's 11 or 12 now, have goals of getting to zero carbon energy. Ours is by 2045. I mean, the cool thing is, like, it was just an idea at the time, and it seemed so radical, and no one could believe that we had the audacity to even be discussing it, let alone proposing it. And then folks at Stanford, 5 years ago, were really like, we can actually do this. Why set a goal of 50% or 60%? We need to get to 100%. So it shows the power of ideas to push stuff forward. And also, I remember Amory Lovins, I think we even talked about it at the time, was like, the Stone Age didn't end by running out of stones, and the oil age is not going to run out of oil. And so the question is, I mean, bizarrely, the price of oil being at zero means that many destructive oil extraction practices become unaffordable, like tar sands. You can't extract oil from tar for less than like $45 a barrel. So when I think yesterday the futures market was actually negative 40 for a point. Like, you would have to pay someone, Sigrid, to take the oil off your hands because there's no storage capacity. So who knew that the cheaper the price got, potentially the more we can institute zero carbon policies.
Yeah, it's such a poignant and interesting time. It just feels like we're living the metaphors, right? We're just living, everything is becoming actualized. And I want to start with one of kind of the first symbols or images of the environmental movement, or some of the first. And in Santa Barbara, speaking of oil, that was the 1969 oil spill. As you and I are kind of part of the next generation of environmental activists that came out of that wave, so we really rely on the stories of our elders to tell us what was the impetus and the energy of the 60s that led to Earth Day. And, as I mentioned, in Santa Barbara, our elders talk about the oil spill and the grief and the anger of that came out of that. But many in my circle also talk about that Earthrise photo that was taken from the Apollo 8 mission, and how that shifted their world view and their view of themselves, because it really turned out that during that exploration, the real message from that mission was when the explorers turned around and looked back at ourselves and realized our interconnection and our humanity and our dependence on one another. I'm just curious, like, what stories from your elders resonated with you growing up about the birth of the environmental movement?
Well, I'll tell you my age. So I was born in September 1969. So I was born between July 4th, when, the man landed on the moon, and April 22nd, 1970, which was the first Earth Day. So, I mean, I always tease that, my brother, who was born before, like, has no idea how to do technology, but because I was born after the man landed on the moon, I kind of have some idea. I mean, for me, it really has more to do, like, I grew up with the mythology of Joseph Campbell and kind of thinking through the deep connections that we've had with Earth during our entire evolution. And really this concept that we were born from the Big Bang, and scientifically, we kind of can conceptualize what that means, that there was this infinitesimally dense atom before which there was no space or time. So if you think about that, that there was this atom that created every single thing in the known universe, it just shows that we're kind of all made of stardust, and that we're all connected, like the table, the computer, us. And the more that I get involved in the environmental movement, especially things like the microbial loading in our bodies, more than half the genetic material in us is foreign to us. We are not born with. It's microbes that come from the world around us. And so I think we've developed this level of belief in our independence with technology since the birth of the environmental movement that's really dangerous. It kind of gives us this sense of comfort and security and ability to not need each other, not need the natural world, somehow that we're better than the rest of the natural world and nature. So I don't know, I think it's recreating a mythology for the next 50 years based on our interconnection. So the more I think about it, the more kind of connection between spirituality, religion, the environmental movement, and science needs to be the future, because the past has been just overly reliant on, especially the most recent past, on we can do it alone, where technology and money and owning stuff is going to help us get where we need to go, whereas it probably won't.
And so timely. Wow, we went deep real fast on that first question, and thank you, because that's exactly how I feel and how I think about it. And it really resonates right now, right? Because we're in this moment in time where we also have to turn around, go home, and we're focusing and we're realizing the importance of our interdependence, that we're really relying on each other. We're all connected, and we're relying on each other to maintain public health, right? Mm-hmm. So
and that planetary health, the Harvard study about how air pollution exacerbates your lack of tolerance to COVID-19, like there are all these other stresses that disadvantaged and other communities are suffering more because of predisposition, because of all these environmental stresses that exist in their communities. And it's not just one thing or the other. There's a lot at play.
Absolutely. And yet the flip side of that too is kind of one of the striking results of what we're going through, this kind of rolling shutdown of businesses, is that significant reduction in air, land, and water pollution, and even noise pollution. So it feels to me like we're kind of getting this real-time look at the burden that we impose on the planet during normal times. It's almost like, virtual reality without the virtual reality headset, right?
Yeah, it's surreal.
Yeah, and obviously that economic shutdown in and of itself is kind of a natural disaster, and we cannot maintain that, and we need to find our way to navigate our way through that very quickly. But I'm personally interested in helping myself and others kind of retain the memory of the few positives of this situation, including that short break from hyper-consumerism. So I'm just curious as how you think we can use this time to kind of mine for those gems that we can carry forward.
I mean, one of them, Sigrid, is most obviously, I think working in a large organization, there's this reticence across the board to let people work from home, to have that flexibility. And with house prices going up, people live further and further from where they work. And right now, 94% of our workforce at Cal EPA, so of the 6,200 people, 92% of them are working at home, and they're doing a great job. And I think managers, part of that memory of what's happened is like, it actually works. You actually can work at home. Not all jobs are created equal, and so there's also issues of inequality around who can and can't work at home. But for those who can, allowing them to work at home so that the streets are empty for those who actually need to get to work, those kind of things I think are really important. Others, to me, you just mentioned one of them, which is I'm in Sacramento. I live under the flight path of the Sacramento airport. It's been blissful. Like, one of the more innovating things that we don't think about is noise pollution. And just our tolerance for it has increased. But when it's gone, it's like, wow, this is incredible. And our ability for self-reflection, I think, we don't have a lot of time normally. Now we have lots of time to contemplate and think. And I miss that. I realize how much I'd miss that. And just simple things, as you pointed out, like we can get by with a lot less than we thought. And really goes back to kind of the original question, which is, of all the things that are worth celebrating on Earth Day, life itself seems to be the most important. Like that's what we're fighting for now is a chance at living life to its fullest. And when it's taken away by COVID-19, by the pandemic, we have time to reflect on what that means. But it also means we have to take full advantage while we can of the precious days we have on the planet. And our own mortality seems like the last taboo subject, in the United States. If you go to Mexico or India or many other places, people talk about mortality, but we hold that very close to us. And so that's another result of like, how do we think about intergenerational equity? How do we think about what it means to be alive right now? So yeah, a lot going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, not everyone is experiencing the kind of the luxury of time to think and during all this. And there's, there are a lot of kind of components, including some justice components that I want to dig into here in a second. But one of the things that really struck me today is that one of the key pieces of legislation that emerged from this era that we're talking about 50 years ago was the Clean Air Act, which is also marking its 50th anniversary this year. And the American Lung Association put out their State of the Air report today, which tracks data through 2018. So it doesn't get 2019 and 2020 and doesn't get this time period we're in right now. But I'm struck by how 5 of the top cities with the worst air pollution in the US are in California: Los Angeles, Bakersfield, Fresno, and so forth. And even Santa Barbara and Santa Maria, we're seeing an uptick during that time period, worst ever air qualities in terms of particle pollution in the history of that report. So some of that had to do with data coming from those being the hottest years on record that we had and climate-driven wildfires. But it really seems timely to me to be talking about air quality right now with so many intersecting themes. I know you're dealing with many of them: the Trump administration's trying to roll back vehicle efficiency standards, the increase in climate-related fires, and then to my point earlier, how it appears that COVID-19's impacts more seriously affect community populations that are already dealing with poor air quality. So I'm just curious as to what's your greatest concern in all of that. You focused?
I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head, Sigrid, which is COVID-19 is just exposing huge disparities and inequality in our society that are there. And as you said, if you're living with 7 of your family members in a 500 square foot trailer, that's very different than having the luxury of being in a single family home. And so there are huge disparities. Also, when we think about essential workers, who's having to go to the fields to pick the food so that we can eat, who's working in the grocery stores and gas stations and pharmacies, it's a lot of communities of color and low income communities that are still commuting, that still have issues, very real issues right now, and often are not getting the worker protection that they need. So that's a big focus right now of ours, is really making sure that we spend time looking at how to solve some of those issues. In terms of air pollution, there's been huge gains over the last 50 years since Earth Day. If you think about LA and the smog, and then the invention of the catalytic converter, and all those gains are real. At the same time, when you look at where we're failing in terms of meeting our greenhouse gas reduction targets, it's all in the transportation sector. And diesel particulate matter, which we know is a carcinogen, continues to plague communities that live along the side of transit corridors that live by freight hubs like ports and locomotive yards, and mainly those are disadvantaged communities. So this intersection between public health and vulnerability and where the emissions still are is huge. And I don't think it was kind of given enough attention back in 1970. I don't think the science wasn't there. You know, what we've seen is the air has gotten cleaner and cleaner, but the science has shown us that sorry, I don't know if you heard that, but there was like a big ding. So the science has shown us that that we really at small quantities of things like PM 2.5, which is very, very fine micrograms of particulate matter, you'd think, oh, they have issues with the lungs, but really it's actually issues with the heart. It's blocking the passageways to the heart and causing heart attacks and premature deaths in California, very large scale. Last year, I think it was between 8,000 and 12,000 people died prematurely from air pollution. And most of those were communities of color and low-income communities. We have the highest asthma rates in the nation in places like Fresno. So we got a long way to go is the point. You know, we can look back and see the gains that we've made. And I would say, you know, some of both the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, and the Clean Air Act are probably, if you look at public health gains over the last 50 years, probably the most successful public health laws in our country. By dealing with those issues, we've really reduced mortality in many, many areas. As you pointed out, we are defending ourselves against significant attacks from the Trump administration. We're not looking for this fight, but we're certainly going to defend ourselves. Today, we're issuing a lawsuit to protect endangered species in California, to make sure that the pumping operations of water from Northern California to Southern California don't endanger fish species. And we're already seeing impacts of the federal government's action. So, you know, as you mentioned on clean cars, the American automobile manufacturers came together with President Obama and came out with a deal that Trump has reneged on. And so we'll be taking litigation action on that. I think we're now at 45 lawsuits that California has brought against the Trump administration. I don't think we've lost any to date. But it's unfortunate that of the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, we're still having these questions that were once bipartisan issues of concern. And to me, they still are. Everyone breathes the same air, drinks the same water. We should really work, I think, in the next 50 years to make sure that people look back and say, wow, it was so weird in 2020 how this was a partisan issue. Thank God, you know, in 2070, it's an issue where people have come together again.
Absolutely. It really calls to mind to me as well the importance of having strong states like California, right? We cast a pretty big shadow globally. We're the 5th largest economy in the world. You know, I know lately there's been quite a debate about the term nation states, but even before that, I was recently reading Rahm Emanuel's new book about city states. And it got, or nation cities, excuse me, and it got me really thinking about the power that communities can have, particularly in a time like now when we are not seeing leadership on climate and environmental issues from the federal government. So just from your perspective, what cities or counties in California do you really see with a truly visionary agenda, ones that we in Santa Barbara might turn to or look at as we push our leaders to think bigger?
Well, just at the initial point, Sigrid, I mean, I just have to agree. I mean, since the birth of our nation, and if you look around the world, ideas have come from localities and states. I think we have this idea that somehow they just bubble up and end up turning into legislation in DC. But the Clean Air Act is a great example. The reason that California has authority under the federal Clean Air Act is because we already had one in 1965. Way before the federal government, and Californians in LA in particular were pushing for solving air pollution issues. California, you know, if you look across the big issues of how we reduce toxicity, how we build a circular economy, how we focus on things like basic science at the UCs and the incredible work happening across all of California. When you look at transportation and climate planning, land use planning, how we think about environmental justice. I mean, literally, there's cities like Fresno that have a 74% recycling rate, which is higher than nearly any place in the country. There's projects that relate to drip irrigation, and farmers that are on the cutting edge, and people from around the world are going to the Central Valley to look at how we're doing farming. Santa Barbara now bizarrely has like the most cannabis permits of any county in the nation. So water is a big issue. Pesticides are a big issue to think about, which you probably weren't thinking about. How we work with our sovereign tribal nations, like the Santa Ynez Chumash in Santa Barbara. They're actually, I would say, one of the greenest, most climate conscious tribes in the nation. Our ocean policies, both Santa Barbara, Santa Cruz, Monterey, San Francisco are looking at, with a lot of focus, how we reduce marine pollution into the oceans. And certainly the Brent School at UC Santa Barbara is leading the world in looking at how much trash is going into the oceans. LA, I think, set a goal. Mayor Garcetti recently set this goal of having no ocean discharges from wastewater treatment plants, so billions of gallons of water that are currently going into the Pacific. How do we reuse those? How do we recycle those? His goal is to end that by 2035. Same is true, Republican mayor of Santa Barbara, Mayor Faulkner, his pure water campaign to really look at how San Diego reduces the amount of water coming from the Colorado, and thinking of innovative solutions of water conservation. All the way through San Francisco, if you look at their integrated pest management, how much pesticides they've reduced in their city, it's incredible. And issues of recycling are vexing at this time, because we're going through global kind of complications relating to export bans and all kinds of different stuff. But communities around, in Alameda County, Berkeley, and others are really stepping up their game and looking at how to change the paradigm. So for me, across the board, cities in California are inspiring me. We had a meeting with this group, Green Cities California, recently, and I was just blown away at how much is happening at the local level. How all of them are saying, how do we build out infrastructure for electric vehicles? So electric vehicle charging is only going to happen at the local level. We're going to help, we're going to provide money, but the land use planning, the zoning, the getting it in is local government, as with energy efficiency and solar. So everywhere I go in the state, I'm inspired, whether it's rural California. The final thing I'd say in rural California is people are really looking at on-farm composting and how we use that compost to apply it to the land to sequester carbon, which I think is the next frontier.
Yeah, what I loved about your reply there was it was an intermix of small and large cities, rural areas, and some of the usual suspects, right, Berkeley, but some that you wouldn't really think about, like Fresno. And that speaks to, I think, the level of innovation and communication that's taking place, and that we can all learn from each other. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just curious, what's on your post-COVID pandemic policy wish list?
I think my sense of where we are is that we're not going to return to normal. It isn't going to look like before. So to your earlier point, how do we maintain some of the gains that we've achieved? How do we get to a place that looks environmentally more like where we are now, with reduced emissions, reduced pollution, communities coming together? How do we achieve that? So the governor created this economic recovery task force that I have the honor of sitting on. And I think that's one of the things we're looking at. How do we have a greener, more inclusive, more equitable future for California, springboarding from where we are? So some of the things that we talked about in our budget in January aren't going to happen. they're just, when, you know, the fiscal realities are going to be very stark for government. We're going to have to prioritize, which I think is going to be a painful and at the same time useful exercise. So really those things like equity, I think if we have a recovery that leads to the same inequalities or the same level of pollution, we will have missed a big opportunity.
Yeah, really good. Last question for you. So one of the things I really appreciate you is just about you is your adventurous spirit, and how you just balance the heaviness of the work that you do with getting out into nature. And in fact, a couple of years ago, you took a break between your EPA gigs to hike the Pacific Crest Trail. And I know you still do as much hiking and trail walking as you can. You continue to do your Podship Earth podcast, which seems to me like a way that you stay connected with other interesting minds and adventurers. But you talk about the importance of getting lost. Can you just speak to why that's important to you and how that might be particularly relevant today as we navigate new and unprecedented challenges?
Yeah, I think we're, you know, Sigrid, we have a phone that kind of dictates everything that we do. And we don't have paper maps anymore. Before we go on a journey, we don't look at where we're going. We just plug it in and blindly listen while Siri tells us what streets to turn on. So just the whole experience of getting lost, I think, is almost like a bygone era. Like, it's really hard to get lost. And so that idea of not knowing where you're going fills people with dread. And rather than, for me, you know, when I am lost, hiking, and I went on, after I did the Pacific Crest Trail, I did a section of the Continental Divide Trail with my cousin. And the Continental Divide Trail has no marking. Our maps were terrible. And we got lost probably 6 or 7 times a day. And it was so frustrating. I mean, it's just like, wow, how could we be this far from where we thought? So the first interesting concept, and my cousin was a paratrooper. He was like, which I love, this concept of like bending the map. So he was like, Jared, you know, we want the map to conform with where we think we are. And so we need to really look at where we are more carefully. So that's the first thing about not getting lost, or understanding when you are lost, where the hell are you? How do you get your bearings? And then the other part was just, it's kind of a freedom to be in this place where you get to not know where you are, but know where you want to go and understand how to navigate. So it's, we are in some ways, I think, afraid of saying that we're lost. The minute you know that you're lost, you can either go back to where you last know you were, that makes you feel secure, or you can chart a different course. But sometimes I think we are lost and we just don't acknowledge it. So the hiking metaphor is really like how we go to where we want to get to, how we be comfortable with just being where we are and enjoying it, which is kind of where we got to on this hike, which is you get lost, you get frustrated, and then you sit down, you're like, wow, this is incredibly beautiful. Look at this river, look at these trees. Like, rather than focusing on being lost, focusing on where you are at that moment and being grateful for it.
I've ended on a better metaphor. We started with good metaphors. We ended on a great one that feels very relevant to the moment in time. Just taking a breath and looking at where we are, acknowledging that we are maybe feeling a little bit lost, and feeling gratitude for pieces of it, and knowing that we're going to find our way out. So thank you, Jared. I always really enjoy talking with you. You've got a great brain.
No, it's really fun. And happy Earth Day.
Yes, thank you. All right.
Okay. Take care. Thanks, Iris. Okay, bye.